Hey, I'm Max and welcome to part 3 of the tutorial. There isn't much left to do, so don't give up everyone. Okay, so for this part I actually want to create the player controller so we can drag our mouse or finger to move our players. But since eventually I want to have multiple players, I cannot directly control the players because what if one gets deleted, then you want the others to fill the gap. So you need some kind of object that you're going to move and that the players will gravitate around. So for this player here, I'm just going to drag him into my prefab. So I will have a prefab of the player, original prefab, and then delete him. Then instead of him, I'm going to create an empty game object and call it player controller. And this is the object that I will move and that I will have my players run to. So I will set it to 0, 0, 0. And now I just need to create a script for it. So I'll go in my scripts, create new C# script. And I'll call it player controller. Now for this project, I decided I would use the new Unity input system, not only so this tutorial works for later versions of Unity when this will be basic in the engine, but also because I wanted to work on mobile and PC, and this way I think it's easier. So if you're watching this far in the future, maybe you already have the new input system installed by default, but in my case I need to go to Window, Package Manager. Then I need to go into Packages, Unity Registry, and search for Input. Here there is the input system, version 1.3 right now. You just click Install. So it's going to install the new input system and ask you if you want to disable the old input system. You click Yes, and it will restart your project. Okay, so now my project has restarted with the new input system. So now the only thing I have to do to set up the input system is to go on my player controller, my empty game object, add the component player input, which is from this new package. Then you will see actions none. You can click create actions, and then you can simply click create, and it will create a new input action map for you. Then for this tutorial, we don't need the fire one, so we can delete it, and the move one also. And then if you open up the look with the little arrow, you can see there's already support for pointer, which is like the keyboard and mouse, and the touch, and also gamepad and joystick. So we can save it just like that, save asset. It's important to click it, then you can close it. So now my player controller has a player input, and my player input has a function to look using the delta pointer. So how do I use this? Well, I simply need to add my player controller script I just made to my player controller object, and then inside of my script, I simply have to type public void on look. And this is because if I open up my input action, you can see my action is called look. So if we rename this to something else, then we'll have to type on and then the name we put. So we just left the default look. So now if I go on look, I need to type at the top using Unity engine.input system to have access to the new input system stuff. And then as a parameter, I need to put input value and then the value. Now to get the delta of the mouse, I simply have to do vector2 equals to value.get as a vector2. And of course give a name to my vector2, so I'll just call it delta. And again, if you look at the input actions, you can see action, control type, vector2, and then value. So it's going to give a vector2 value. So this is going to give me the delta of the mouse. Let's try it out just by printing it. Obviously you don't have to do this, I'm just showing you. So now if I open play and I drag around, you can see when I drag, it shows which direction I'm dragging in and at what speed. So if I go faster, you can see the numbers are higher, and if I go slower, then it's very low numbers. So now the way I'll use this is simply by moving my player controller depending on the delta. So I can do something like transform.position plus equals, so add to the position a new vector3, which will be the delta.x, so how much we moved left to right, divided by a value, so it's not too fast, let's say 100. And then for the other two, we put 0 because we only want to move left to right. So now even if I do that, you won't be able to see the game object because it's an empty game object. So if I save this and now I move my mouse, you should be able to see the position of the player controller moving. So that's working fine. Now what I need is a script that will spawn players and make them follow this player controller. So for this, I'll create an empty game object called, let's say, game. And then I'll go in my script, create a script, and call it again game. put this game script on this game object. That's a lot of game, but pretty much a script that will handle all of the game mechanics, such as creating players. Then inside of this game, I will simply have a public game object player prefab so I can spawn them. I will also have a public game object player controller so I can get its position and everything. And I will have a public list of game object called players, and I will initiate it to a new list of game object. So in this list we will keep all of the players we create so we know how many there are and we can delete them easily. Then at the start of the game we want to create one player. So for this I'll just do game object player equals to instantiate the player prefab at the position new vector 3 0 0 and then let's say -5 and a quaternon.identity for no rotation, and then I simply have to add to my list the new player we just created. So this will create our first player and add it to the list. Then in the update, just to test right now, I'm going to do players position 0, so the first player, dot transform dot position equals to player controller dot transform dot position. Obviously we will not keep this, I'm just doing this to show the player controller. So now if I go on my game script, I can put in my player prefab, then I can drag in my player controller from my level or from my scene, and when I hit play I should have one player spawn and following my player controller. And there you go, I have now one player spawn and it's following my player controller. But obviously we cannot have the player follow exactly the player controller, because if there are 10 characters they can't all be in one spot. So instead what we have to do is loop through all of our players and make them go towards the player controller. So the way we can do this is to do a for each player script player in players, but you can see it won't work because players is a list of game object, not a list of player script. So we can change it to a list of player script, but then you can see my players add player doesn't work anymore because this is a game object. So to fix this we simply add player dot get component player script, just like this. So this way we keep in the list the player scripts and not the player's objects. Now what we have to do is get the direction from the player to the player controller so it knows which way to move. So we'll do vector 3 direction is equal to player controller dot transform dot position minus player dot transform dot position. This is going to give us the distance, so to get the direction we need to normalize this, which will make it from a scale of 0 to 1. So basically no matter how far away you are, you will only get the direction with this. And we need to do this, otherwise the further away the player is, the more force will be applied, which would create bugs. Then we need to set our player speed, so to do this we need to go in our player script and add a public rigid body RB. And in the start we do RB equals to get component rigid body. And then in our game we can go back and do player.rb.velocity equals to the direction times the speed. So how fast do we want our players to move towards the player controller? We want it to be fast enough where it feels responsive, but not too fast where the players will be pushing each other too much. I found that 2 works pretty well, so let's try that first. So now we can save this, and we need to not forget to go on our player and add a rigid body because I think it doesn't have one. So let's go on our player prefab and it doesn't have one, so it needs a rigid body. And I think the default settings are good, maybe not use gravity because there's nowhere to fall, so there's no point. So let's try it, see if I forgot anything. Okay, so it seems to move towards the player controller more slowly, but it also moved forward. Or maybe that's where the player controller is, let's see. Okay, yeah, that's because the player controller is too far forward. So where do we spawn our players? We spawn them at -5. So let's put our player controller at -5 as well. Okay, that seems to work fine. So let me just try to create multiple players just to test it out, but obviously don't do this. And you can see all of my players are all grouped up together. You can only see one basically because they're all on top of each other. And the reason for that is because we set their capsule collider to is trigger, which means they cannot collide with each other. So this was actually a mistake. Now let's remove is trigger, but remember what happened before we put it to trigger. So you can see now my players are all rolling around, but remember the bug we had, it collides with the road, so the road doesn't work anymore. So before we fix the players, let's fix the road. So on my road prefab, I can go on layer and add a new layer. Let's say layer 6, I'll call it road. Now I'll go back on my prefab and set the layer to road and save. So now all of my roads are layer road. And then I'm going to go on my player prefab, go into layers, add layer, and then add a layer player. And then go back on my player prefab and set him to player. Yes, change children, that's fine. Then we go into edit, project settings, click onto physics, then scroll at the bottom, and you will see here road and player. So we simply want to disable the collision between road and player, just like this. So this way our road and our player will not collide anymore. So you can see now the road works perfectly, but our players don't. So to fix our players, we can go in the prefab, go into the rigid body, and freeze position except X, and freeze rotation. So now they don't rotate or move anymore, but they're still stuck in one bunch. And just to test it out, I'll change them each to a different X, and it should make them work now. So you can see now that I spawned them each a little bit outside of each other, they can group up and they're just fine. So we need to keep in mind that when we spawn the players, we cannot spawn them on top of each other. So now I can remove all of these excess players, and we can start working on our function to spawn them properly. So I'll create right here, public void create players, and I'll add a int amount so we can pass how many we want to create. Now I will create a vector tree for the original position of the first player, which will be equal to the new vector we put here. So this is just like if there's no players, where do we spawn it? Or like what's the ideal place to spawn it, so like the middle. But obviously when we spawn new players, we want to spawn them as close as possible to our player controller, so they don't spawn to the right when the player controller is to the left. So we will set our original position.x to our player controller.transform.position.x. Then we will create a vector tree position, which will end up being the position that the player spawns at. So at first we will put it at the original position, but we might end up moving away if there are already players there. Then we simply have to loop for the amount of players we want to spawn. So I equals 0, I is smaller than amount, I plus plus, just like usual. Then we want to get the vector tree distance equals to the position we're at right now, minus the original position. And since our position is outside, you can see when we spawn a player, then we go through the loop again, it will keep our old position, which is important for the technique I'm going to use next. Then I will create a bool to check if there are collisions. So collisions equals to physics.check sphere, which is going to check for collisions in a sphere at the position that we are at for a size of, let's say, 0.2. So it will return true if there are players within 0.2 of that point. And then we need to put in the player layers, which we actually didn't do yet. So here I will add at the top public layer mask player layers, and we need to go back to our Unity. So now we want to go on our game prefab, and in the player layers we simply check player. So it will only check for collisions on the player layer, so it will not detect, for example, the road or obstacles. If you don't want your players to spawn on obstacles, then you can add obstacle to the layers here and create a different layer for your obstacles and add it, so it will not spawn on obstacles. Now this is the part that's useful. So if there is a collision, then we know that that spot that we're at, so position, is not good. So what we'll do is if the matf.absolute, so if the absolute of the distance in x is greater than the matf.absolute, so absolute is if it's negative, it's going to be positive to the distance in z. So basically if the number in x is bigger than the number in z, so if it's -8 and 6, it's going to return true. even if -8 is smaller than 6, because absolute is going to turn it into a 8. So if the x is bigger, then we want to move on the z, and otherwise we want to move on the x. So to do this, we'll do pause plus equal new vector 3. We'll do -2f times distance x. So this will flip our x direction, then 0f, then 0.2f, which is going to move it on the z-axis. So here we have our size to 0.2, so we'll check 0.2 next in the z. And we also add -2 times distance x. So if our distance x is 5, then we will add -10, which will make it -5. So basically we flip the x using this, and then we add z. And the other way, we're going to add a new vector 3, which is going to be 0.2. So we move on the x, then 0 and -2f times the distance dot z. So we flip the z and we add to the x. So this way basically it's going to go in an x pattern. So it's going to check top left, top right, and this way it's going to do a circle around the point that we want. That's just something I came up with when I was making that video. I'm not sure if that's the most efficient, but it worked, so let's do this. Also, if we have a collision, we add to the position so we can check in the next position. So what we want to do is continue, so it doesn't do what's going on after, which is going to be spawning a player. And continue is going to make it go to the next loop in the for, but you can see in the for we add to the I. It's going to add to the position vector, but it's going to remove an I, which means that we're going to spawn one less player. So to fix this, we can simply do I minus, so basically saying did not spawn a player. So we're going to remove one, and then the for will do a ++, so it's not going to change it. If we did not have a collision, so here we could do a else, but it doesn't matter because here we have continue anyway. If we did not have a collision, then we can spawn our game object. So game object is going to be equals to instantiate the player prefab at the position that we finally found that has no collision and with no rotation. Then we can simply add to our players.add o.getComponent player script, because it's a list of player scripts. Just like that, we should be able to spawn players that will not collide with each other. So let's try it out by just doing create players, let's say 20. That should be a pretty good test. So you can see they spawn right in a circle and they're following the player controller. So they might not be following it fast enough. So either you can increase the speed that the players go towards the player controller, or one other thing you could do is on the player controller, when you move it, you could also move all of the players that are already active. So pretty much the velocity towards the player controller will simply be to fill holes when players get deleted. So to do this on the player controller, I could have a game for my game script, game, and then do game equals to find object of type game. And this is my game script, remember. And then when I move, I can simply do for each player script player in game.players and simply move them as well. So player.transform.position, and then simply add the same thing. So all of the players will follow the player controller and move at the same time, but they will keep their offsets. And also if there's a hole between the players, for example because they hit the spikes, then this velocity will fill it. So now the players should be a lot more responsive. So when I move my mouse, you can see the players move very fast. So now if I play the game and I try to delete some players, you will see it will create some errors. So if I try to delete some, you can see it creates errors and then messes up everything. And that's because when we delete a player, we need to remove it from the list. Otherwise the list here tries to find a player and it's deleted. So we can simply add a public void delete player, and then we can put in, for example, a player script player so we know which one. And then we can do players.remove, remove the player that we want to remove, and then destroy that player. And then in our player script, when we hit something and we want to destroy, instead we can do find object of type game, and then call our delete player on this, which is this player script right here. So now when we hit something, instead of destroying the game object directly, we call game destroy player, which is going to remove it from the list and then destroy it. So now if I hit those spikes right here, it should cause a hole in the middle of my players, but they should automatically regroup because of the velocity of their rigid bodies. Okay, so you can see it did not work, and that's because I forgot something very important. Here I destroyed the player script, so I only removed the script from the player. I need to do .gameObject, so I removed the whole game object. Okay, so here are the spikes. Now if I go on them, my player should die and then regroup. And there we go, it worked. So there we go, we have the control working and even the regrouping mechanic working. And also anytime we want, we can create new players using our create player. So I think in the next part, I'll do the banners with the plus and multiplication. That will simply call this function and create the amount of players we want. So make sure to check it out.